Hello everybody, thank you for joining me in my first webinar. As part of a webinar series in collaboration with PM Excellence. It's a training and consulting company that's based in India. And the webinar series is about highlighting certain project management concepts and sound frameworks to apply them into real life work practice on projects, programs, and certain portfolios. So today my webinar is on lessons learned in project scope management. To start off, I want to introduce you with a few housekeeping rules. So this session is actually being pre-recorded before the actual webinar. So the structure is a little bit different in that it will exclude the Q&A with the audience. However, your input is important to us, so I've created a very short 2-minute post-webinar survey that you can access it at the end of this webinar, which will include a slide at the end. As we mentioned, I already talked about PM Excellence, and they're the forthcoming leader in this webinar series. I'm pretty excited to be presenting with them today. So a little bit about me. My name is Ilham Ali. I'm a project management professional, and I've co-managed and led a series of projects in various industries, from international trade, business development, and now in health technology. And I've also worked in private and public sectors here in the United States and abroad. So I'll just jump right in. The objectives for today's webinar are in accordance to a lot of the feedback that I've gotten from working with various project managers and teams of global standing, is that there are certain causes and challenges of scope management, and one of them for identifying scope creep is that managers and teams are not able to identify stakeholders at the best time in the beginning of the project. And so today I'll talk a little bit about how you manage their expectation and also gain their support. The second objective today is to gather sound requirements according to best practices, and how do you document your scope in a way that you can control it and validate it. And the third is to deliver a viable WBS, or as we know it, as a work breakdown structure. And the last is probably the most important for you, is to avoiding scope creep and controlling these change requests that you might be getting a lot during your project. The main model that will be guiding for the webinar today would be based on the PMBOK. The PMBOK refers to the project management body of knowledge. It's the oldest and most renowned model that we have in terms of best practices for project management process groups and knowledge areas. And as you can see here, I've highlighted it in red the top 5 buckets that I'll be focusing on today, about how they all integrate into really effective scope management. So you'll see here on the right basically the buckets that I'll be addressing in order, and they'll be highlighted. And then on the left is the structure for each process group in terms of me defining their key terms and concepts. And then the second is what is the framework behind them. And then the last is I'll give you examples of tools and templates that I've used at my work that I found pretty helpful. So our first goal is to identify stakeholders and manage their expectation. And a stakeholder, according to PMBOK for its 6 editions, basically any person that might affect or be affected by a specific outcome of a project or activity. And so here on the left column, you'll see that these are common project stakeholders, from the manager itself, project management team, the central team. But I would probably contend that the project sponsor is probably the most important. And one of them is because he or she will provide you with the support for the project, whether it's financially or gives you the strategic direction on how to move forward. But also, the project sponsor will define whether this is a yes go or no go for the project, and approval whether this is in accordance, the deliver was achieved in accordance to requirements. Other stakeholders you want to keep cognizant about when you're trying to identify who's in your project are functional managers who might define your resources, senior management that might be giving you constraints on your budget, government agencies that can also hinder in terms of requirements or even fasten approval for certain processes, suppliers and subcontractors, and even the media itself. This is an example of a framework that I always keep in mind in terms of who's an internal stakeholder versus an external one. And it gives me an idea of how both in and out of the company stakeholders play together in a dynamic that allows the company to thrive from various projects and programs. So this next slide is all about from Make-A-Wish Foundation. And this is an example that I copied and pasted for certain constituents that play together. For example, here in internal constituents, you'll see that their volunteers play an important role in making sure that certain donations and certain events are actually being implemented. So this framework actually gives us an idea about certain tools that I've used. So these next couple slides are actually copied and sourced from Bonnie Clyde, who is the current director for health technology portfolio at the Massachusetts Medical Society. And this is an example of her work that she has done for the site license project for medical education. And you can see here that she's mapped out the certain customers and partners and governance all to come together into the kinds of team that you bring about and the service providers. This is an important visual way of capturing your stakeholders because it provides you with a structure of governance. And governance in itself will give you a really important idea about who is in your stakeholder list that allows you to translate that into a stakeholder register. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the next few slides so you can see how the progression of identifying your stakeholders is really important. So this is like an Excel version of what Bonnie has done from taking out from the context diagram. And so this specific stakeholder chart is pretty helpful for governance and initial discovery. And it's also involved in scope, and especially for change management to understand, okay, who's in our team, what's their contact information, is basic preliminary information that you will need to gather that will help you to define your scope as much as you can get from your stakeholders' input and also their expectation. So this chart itself is going to translate into a register. And this is a register that can indicate your power and interest grid. And part of what power and interest is all about is trying to figure out where do they fit into a grid that will be mapped up in 4 ways, which I'll talk about a little bit more in the end, but this is more of a preview about how you can start anticipating this matrix. So a stakeholder analysis matrix will help you to get into this point to figuring out what their concerns are. So the matrix, what I would always have is the stakeholders' role, their contact information, categorizing them, whether they're internal and external, their interest, or even influence or power, expectations, and also communication requirements. There's a column that I would also put, especially for high-level risky projects, I would put contingency plan on how to manage different scenarios of stakeholders. I'll get into that a little bit more at the end when managing scope creep because this becomes extremely important. And so that in itself is translated into exactly specifically the strategy for engaging these stakeholders. The reason I've added the impact and power, or impact and power influence, or influence itself, is that it allows you to understand where do stakeholders fit in a grid and how do you manage them, whether it's actually avoiding a specific low power or low interest and managing them extremely closely, or providing them with the right information. So that will tell you exactly how you will define your tactic and strategy for this. And so this gives you an idea about where do they add, how do they contribute those stakeholders, and how they might even block it. And how do you forecast specific strategies for engaging your stakeholder in accordance to different scenarios. The second goal is to gather requirements and to define your scope. And I think this will fit really nicely into how our stakeholders' management expectation will fit. And you'll see how throughout this entire grid here on the right, how they all fall into place together. So scope in itself is an interesting concept where it has to balance two important terminologies. One is product scope, and the second is project work. And often they're both confused with each other, but they're very distinct. So let's just first understand what scope is. And it's basically the kind of work that you need to accomplish in order to deliver a specific product, service, or results with accordance to your deliverables, features, and functions. And so that in itself, let's explore a little bit more about what product scope versus project work. We already know that product scope is basically the functions and features of the product itself or the service or result. So basically the project's deliverable, right? And it has certain attributes that we would want to think about, whether it includes the look and feel, the user interface experience, the content, navigation, your data analytics. However, it comes with a specific framework. So you might start off in a product scope with inception requirements, but inception might include maybe 2 projects or 3 projects and so forth. Project work, on the other hand, is all about what is the specific kind of work that we need to accomplish in order to get to getting to the features and functions of the product. So you will see a lot of things from figuring out how to manage your human resources, your processes, your technologies, and it's all about team building, communication, change management, and certain operational duties. And so the framework that you'll tend to see is balancing 3 really important constraints, which is scope, time, and cost, under a specific framework like initiate, plan, execute, monitor, and close. And so I want to give a really quick disclaimer about this framework on initiating to closing, because it tends to follow a waterfall processes where one process cannot start until we figure out what the last process was. But this is quite different from an agile perspective where we work in different iterations and we prototype our work a lot. So I just wanted to give that really quick disclaimer. And then the second one is that one of the really interesting things about these kinds of framework is that it provides you with an idea of the size of the project. And it's a rule of thumb when we're doing rolling wave planning. That's when we really don't have an idea about what our requirements are. So we have to work incrementally as much as we can get information. And so these frameworks are extremely important because they give you an idea in terms of boundaries. And if there's one thing you would want to take out of this webinar for today, is that think in terms of boundaries and ask which of these parameters really matter the most to you and most to your project sponsor. And you should ask them which of these boundaries are extremely important to you, and is it delivering on time, on budget? Because it allows us to question what we can basically fit into our project work, correct? And allows you to figure out what is linear and what is non-linear. So one example that I would bring in here is I'm currently consulting for an organization in which I have to deliver an MVP, which is a minimal viable product. And one of it is a health information management system that I have to build with the team that comes from various requirements, and various people have completed it in the past but have not fully achieved the right quality requirements. And so in this case, before I started on the project, I was able to ask the project sponsors on what is currently the most important to them. And to them, it's basically scope, adherence to requirements, because time and cost are leeways in which they're flexible on to work on in the next 6 to 7 months. So that's something that gives me an idea on how I can move forward with the project and meet expectations. And so when I ID my stakeholders and I get a sense of boundaries from the first questions that I ask with my customers and project sponsors, is that I start off with a specific project charter, and this is also from Bonnie too, which is a template that I've also used and found extremely helpful. And it tells you an idea early on in the project about what acceptance is. It gives me an idea of success. and who I'm working with from the functional organization, and what is the basic functions as a scope if it has been already differentiated from the market, and what kind of requirements do I need to start thinking of early on. This is another template that I've used and found it pretty interesting. You would know as you work with different teams what kinds of visuals would be more appealing to them. I would always say keep it short and simple. And this is an example of certain timelines and deliverables that I keep in mind, the initial team members that I have. And I just want to note your timeline will change over time in accordance to the information and requirements that you get. And this is the last one that I'll show you, a business case. I do really like it because it gives me also an understanding of boundaries. And your milestones, as I mentioned, are very malleable. And it depends on if you work in technology on multiple iterations of discovery. So this is just another template that I found to be extremely useful. Now we've understand a little bit as we started on your stakeholders and the specific needs. So we started on why do we need to this project to exactly what. So we'll start from why to what to how. Now this is the what. So what is a requirement? It's basically a specific condition that you need to be present in your project's deliverables so that you can satisfy a specific contract that's imposed by your customer. And these are the best guidelines that I found was really good to stick to for good requirements. And it has to satisfy these four things on the left on do they satisfy your business needs and your primary goals? And do they capitalize on certain opportunities in the market? And do they address constraints from your population and your audience? And it has to be prioritized, measurable, and testable in the other categories. And so one example that I can give you from working in technology, so one of the requirements that I have from actually developing an enterprise data warehouse is that it has to be able to measure my organization's performance in collecting data in a specific amount of time versus using a different software. So we were moving from Excel to MS Access as a way to integrate all of our member data as part of my last organization. So I was able to have specific requirements that gives me an idea about my evaluation from a baseline to an actual. So in itself, if my actual results do satisfy this requirement, then I know it has met my business need. So we've already talked about collecting. Now we're talking about developing these requirements. The way you will develop your requirements will depend a lot on how you've structured your project charter and also how you've collected information from your stakeholders. And if you remember in our stakeholder register in that last slide, we talked a little bit about how asking the right questions to your stakeholder and what's important to them and how do you manage their expectation is such an important role, because one of the common causes of scope creep is that stakeholders have been conditioned to expect added product functionality, and that they have no awareness of project work or cost is not their responsibility. So stakeholders do not necessarily understand how to balance the constraint of time, costs, even scope, quality, risk, and certain resources. And so we need to make sure that we have all these stakeholders on board from the initiation of the project, so we don't have those requirements slip and we don't have those change requests happen as early as possible. We want to control that requirements, the definition development early on to avoid scope creep. And so categorizing your requirements would require two buckets. Think of it as in project requirements and solution. So project requirements is basically anything that you would need to in order to complete your work. So a requirement would be is that your project cannot expand more than 30 human resources because your current budget does not allow room for flexibility beyond a specific standard deviation or something like that. A solutions requirement is anything that falls into your product's development. So it's product functions and features. This is an example of a context diagram that I've completed for a project on Microsoft HoloLens for the public sector here in New York. And here I mapped out specific business goals, the dependencies, and the basically the main business function from the customers and system platform. So this is wonderful for creating boundaries again. And there's so many tools and techniques for collecting and developing your requirements, from interviews, focus groups, facilitated workshops, even prototyping and benchmarking. And context diagrams is just one of them. It helps me understand, who's part of my academic team that can help me develop this technology from their standpoint versus the clinical team and my supportive staff, and how they all working together in order to achieve my business goal. And this is another tool that I've used. So you have your context diagram on the right, but you also have your interrelational diagram on the left. And this is for another project that I did on loneliness and the impact of loneliness on emotional and economic costs here in the United States. And this is part of a group creativity technique that I've done with a very small team, but I found extremely helpful on trying to figure out the requirements for creating a website for providing resources on loneliness. And here we were able to map out certain requirements on how we would structure the website based on different buckets of what would cause loneliness on a specific metric scale. And then on the right, the context diagram allows us to understand what are the top 3 buckets we could use for podcasts or different mediums that we can add to the website. And we found out it has to do with social demographic factors, health outcomes, and social networks. Now that we've talked about different techniques, I wanted to show you how it all fits in together for collecting requirements. And you can see here for collecting requirements, the inputs are mainly your scope management plan. But I wanted to focus first on the 2 things that we already mentioned. One is the project charter, and the second is your stakeholder management plan. And as we mentioned, these are really important things that will help you get to your outputs, which is your requirements documentation, which is what you'll basically get from your project requirements and your product requirements. And you have a requirements traceability matrix. And that's basically understanding whose requirement does it belong to and who will be responsible for it. So that will go back again to your stakeholder register and how you gathered their expectation and information. So we talked about already how stakeholders don't necessarily understand the balance of both of these, product scope and project work, hence why we are collecting requirements and defining the scope very well by involving everybody in the beginning of the initiation of your project, with creating the right document for project charter and the documents necessary for managing stakeholders in a stakeholder register. So let's look at how you're defining scope in this framework. There are various tools and techniques that I've used. I've found facilitated workshop to be very helpful when I work at the New York State Department of Health AIDS Institute, specifically when we were working on clinical education for a program that spanned over 5 to 6 projects for the state of New York. And I found that sitting with and creating surveys and workshops with physicians and different health allied professionals was really important to understand how the scope of the program was 10 to 15 years ago, and how has it changed over time in accordance to specific health outcomes that we're evaluating at the state. And so that gave me an idea about what's my project scope statement. Now, to give you an idea of how your project scope statement would be like, so this is a template that I found online that I've used for quite a while and I found extremely helpful. The components of a scope statement is that it defines the boundaries by answering what does the project consist of and why is it necessary, and what business value will the project deliver once it's done. So you'll see components of a scope statement: objectives, your product scope description, your product acceptance criteria, and you'll also have like your project deliverables, constraints, assumptions, and exclusion. So this is basically a snapshot of what it contains. And this is such an important document because it gives you an idea of how do you create your work-based structure. So you can see here on the right, I'm just going to iterate so you understand how everything fits in together, is that we've developed a project charter, identify your stakeholders, collected requirements, and define your scope. But this is all in order for you to create a work-based structure that's effective and sound. So let's go through that. We've moved now from the why, from the project charter, to the what, in collecting requirements and defining our scope, to the how, which is delivering a work breakdown structure. And a WBS, according to PMBOK, is a deliverable-oriented hierarchical decomposition of the work to be executed by the project team to accomplish the project objective and create the required deliverables. So to give you a framework on what this would look like, is that decomposition is the main tool to break down the project goal to major deliverables into adequate estimates. And this is a process that involves heavily your team to get buy-in. And this is one that I've used for a while and I found extremely helpful, in which it allows you to identify your components to the most detailed level possible. So this upside down triangle gives you an idea how you're dividing your deliverables to work packages so you can estimate in accordance to your cost and time. Now, this is an example of a work-based structure. It's horizontally, so it's from left to right, and it gives you an idea for a web page and for our website in totality at the end of the project. And it gives you here of how you're converting certain modules, educational modules, to the right environment with the technical requirements, and what are the kinds of reports that I need to able to deliver and develop in accordance to each work package, in addition to the web page content, so front-end development here with CSS, and how am I supposed to be integrating all this into the current system that I have. And it goes on and on to for each work package. You're trying to estimate as much as you can. Now, I'm going to make sure to bring from goal 1 to goal 3 all together to see how there are certain challenges that we might face as project managers and as team members. In a way, we can avoid scope creep and control change requests from goals 1 to 3. So scope creep is basically the uncontrolled expansion to your project or scope or product scope without adjusting for certain constraints, including your time, costs, and resources. And I'm providing you with the top 6 constraints of a project that I've always been cognizant of. And so the top 4 reasons for why scope creep happens is that, one, and I mentioned this before, is that stakeholders don't understand necessarily how to balance the constraint of these 6 constraints of a project. And second, stakeholders have been conditioned to expect adding functionality to product scope won't necessarily affect your project work when it actually is. And the third is that usually project requirements are not clean for every stakeholder. That's why it's really important to involve everybody in the initiation of the project. And the last is that there is a lack of effective change management, and that's something I'll touch upon a little bit in the next few slides. So our framework is that when you're thinking of scope creep, well, one of them we're going to tackle is lack of an effective change management, is that you want to have an effective process in hand, and that requires your change approval governance. So in the beginning, we talked about your context diagram and how it provides you with an idea of project governance and project structure. And so this will give you an idea also of like your change approval and who's part of this board that will approve things. And you also have to have templates, right? Your team members can't request uh, changes out of thin air. They have to have a template to log them. And there should be a change log where you're documenting all these changes, whether it's changes in a specific Word document or it's a major change in technical requirement for a product. Then you also want to document lessons learned. So in every project that I've completed, I always ask team members and also managers on what have they learned and what are certain knowledge areas where you think we could have improved on and grew better at specific, given knowing what we know now. So let's go through a specific template. So this is a change your profile template that I've used before, and it includes mainly the important things that I care about. It's like definition of the change, your impact, the cost of it, schedule, budgets, and are there any alternatives to this change, or does this have to be the change that it has to be for solution? And then your approvals. I usually keep my change approvals extremely short and succinct. If they were long, then most likely my change team or even team members would not be motivated to be completing this. So short and simple as usual. This is an example of another one that I've used. It's also pretty helpful. I thought that the recommendation from my team was actually quite useful because it gave me an idea from their point of view about how they're recommending it. And so I'll give you an example here a little bit in the end on test windows and how I was able to work with another QA or quality assurance lead on a specific project and how our change control was pretty effective. So the framework for figuring out who's part of your process is that one of the reasons that we talked about for scope creep, aside from an effective change management, is that we're not sure of how to who's in the project itself and the stakeholders, and this is where you would want to figure out your communication approach. So this is a great PMI question for those who are pursuing the PMP and CAPM certification. Understanding how many people you'll be dealing with in different pathways. So N is the number of stakeholders. So let's say you have 5 people in your team, excluding you. Then that's basically 10 different channels. You put 5 here. And so you have to be cognizant of how the more you involve different stakeholders in your project, the more communication pathways and channels will be involved. So just keep that in mind. That's where the stakeholder register is really important because it allows you a method to document these communication in a way that will figure out whether communication via email or other means would be helpful. As promised, this is another framework that I mentioned to you in the stakeholder register. This is based on power and interest, and it's a grid that allows you to understand where stakeholders fit in and what's your communication and also strategy in managing certain scenarios that you might encounter with them. And so this is an example of something that I found really helpful. One of the organizations that I worked for, we had to get approval and push to include a specific board director to play an active role in specific projects. And so our key was to move that board director from the latent bucket into the promoter without compromising our relationship and our long-term trust that we've developed. And so this allowed me to figure out how to stop keeping them satisfied, but also manage them closely and keeping them actively engaged in the process of my project. This is another matrix. It's super, super simple. And it includes like what's your role, what, when, how, and how you're responding. And it just complements the stakeholder register that I showed you in the beginning. And so this is a test window. So this is what I was referring to in a couple slides back about how how scope creep can happen because of a lack of effective change management. And when I have change management templates or change approval, I always get buy-in from the teams that I work with to understand their their perspective. So this test windows has been through various iterations from the QA team lead in my team, and we were going through a project that involves artificial intelligence to create a product for that will disrupt the publishing industry. So it will allow scientific authors to basically publish for free their articles and edit them for free and get them peer reviewed without charge. And this test window allowed us to understand where certain processes will happen in accordance to buckets. So I've changed the information here for confidentiality reasons and added dummy data and dummy information. But it closely mimics a little bit of how my team member did. And you see here underlined is that we've changed the dates in accordance to their expert criteria, and I've allowed changes to be approved in accordance to our board because we've had different requirements change from our project sponsor, but also my team were the experts in what they did in developing this product. So one of the key things I always give advice on in terms of how do you manage stakeholders is that one, you want to listen to them. You want to get their input and understand where they're coming from, but also get expert judgment. And in this case, my team member was the expert judge in understanding how quality assurance for this product would be scaled up for a larger audience. And so some of the key summary points I would like to leave you with that I've talked about is that first, ask the right questions on defining your project boundaries. And this happens really early on in the project when you're developing a project charter. And second, ID your stakeholders and their potential impact, and also assess how each of your stakeholders might react in specific scenarios that are important to you. And the third is gather good requirements. Remember those 4 buckets that we talked about what makes good requirements, from the business case to your goals, to your opportunities and constraints. Think of those and try to integrate that in your project charter and your management plan. The fourth, is leverage decomposition. It's a tool that helps you align with your project scope management and your requirements. And the last is that make sure you have an effective change approval process in place. This requires you to understand your templates, your governance, your stakeholders, your lessons learned, as we talked about. So that basically is the end of my webinar. If you have any questions for me, please add them down here. I'll probably be publishing this on LinkedIn and Facebook, or feel free to send me an email at elham.yusufali@gmail.com and connect with me on LinkedIn. Lastly, I really value your feedback, so please take our 2-minute survey at this link, bit.ly/scope webinar. I really appreciate it, and have a great rest of the day.